Greetings. This is m squared, and we're going to multiply and divide some complex numbers. And if you remember, I is the square root of -1, so if we have I, we can leave it. That's simplified. But if we ever have an I squared, we need to change that to what I squared equals, which is -1. So basically, we're just pretending that it's an x, except for if we have an I squared. So we're doing like terms when we have a binomial times a binomial. We multiply using a method called FOIL. Some people use that. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to take 2 and multiply it by 3 and get 6. Then the outers are these two. I'm going to multiply this 2 by that -4i and get -8i. These two multiplied together is 15i, and the lasts is a -20i squared. So you see this I squared here. We're not going to be able to leave that. So these two are combinable, and that gets us a 7i, and these are combinable as well. The I squared is a -1, and a -20 times a -1 is a +20, plus 6 is 26. And when you write these numbers, you always want to write it in a plus bi form, because that's standard form of a complex number, with the real part first and the imaginary part last. So now on to these. We're going to, since there's 3 binomials multiplied together, we're going to take these two and multiply them first, and then we'll take that answer and multiply it by the final one. So when we do our FOIL, we get -2 plus I, it's these two, then minus 10i, and then plus 5i squared. And 5i squared is really -5 because it's -1 times 5, and -5 minus 2 is -7. When we combine these parts, we get a -9i. And now that that's simplified, we're going to multiply it by this one. So using our FOIL, we get -7 times -3, which is 21. We get a +14i, a +27i, and a +18i squared. 21, and remember this becomes a -18 because I squared is -1. So 21 minus 18 is 3. And when we multiply these together, did I say 14 and write down a 4? I sure did. That's a 14 plus a 27, so that's 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 41. So it looks like we have 3 plus 41. I. So I said multiplying and dividing. These lines mean divide, but when we divide, we actually just simplify to get rid of the square roots in the denominator. So I need to get rid of the i's in the denominator for this to be simplified. So what I do is I multiply by whatever the square root is, if there's just one term. So I'm going to multiply the top and the bottom of that fraction by I to simplify it. And when I do that, I'm going to use distributive properties. So I'm going to get 3i plus 8i squared in the numerator, and I'm going to get 2i squared in the denominator. Remember, I have to simplify these I squared, so that becomes a -8, and that becomes a -2. So I end up with 3i plus -8 over -2. But remember, I want to write it in that standard form. So I want to write this separately from this. So -8 divided by -2 is a +4, and then I get a -3/2 I. So this is this guy simplified. Now you'll notice the difference over here is there's a binomial in the denominator, and when that happens, you can't just multiply by I. If you did, you'd get rid of I here, but you'd get an I on with the 3. So we multiply by what's called a conjugate of the denominator. So a conjugate is the same terms with the opposite sign. So if that's a minus, you're going to multiply it by 3 plus 2i, but if it was a plus, you'd have the minus here. So it's always the opposite sign, but the same two terms. So when I do that, I'm going to have to use FOIL in the numerator and the denominator. So I get 12 plus 8i minus 15i minus 10i squared in the top. In the denominator, I get 9 plus 6i minus 6i minus 4i squared. And now to simplify, the bottom, those cancel out. I get a -4 times a -1, which is a +4, so 9 plus 4 is 13. Over here, that's a -10 times I squared, which becomes a +10. If I add that to the 12, I get a 22. And if I combine these, I get a -7i. So if I wanted to get it in standard form, some teachers might say that's okay. But if you do need to get it in standard form, you have to have the real part separate from the imaginary part. And that is how you multiply complex numbers and also simplify them if they're being divided or in fractions. Good luck. M Squared signing out.